Mike Sullivan stood in his backyard, hands on his hips, surveying the inflatable above-ground pool that had been the centerpiece of his family's summer fun for the past 3 months. The crisp October air carried hints of the impending fall, and the forecast warned of the first frost of the season approaching next week. It was time. "All right, old friend," he muttered to the pool, "your season has come to an end." What Mike didn't realize as he began the mundane task of pool dismantling was that this routine end-of-season chore would spiral into neighborhood drama that would have the local police department in stitches. The Pinewood Estates neighborhood had once been a quiet, friendly community where neighbors waved to each other and occasionally shared garden tools. That was before Patricia Winters, better known these days as Patio Patrol Patricia behind her back, had moved into the colonial-style house directly behind Mike's. In the 18 months since her arrival, Patricia had transformed from a seemingly normal new neighbor into the self-appointed enforcer of her own unique interpretation of the Homeowners Association guidelines. "Dad, can I help?" 10-year-old Emma bounded into the backyard, her ponytail swinging with each step. "Sure can, kiddo. We need to drain this bad boy and get it packed away before the temperature drops." Mike ruffled his daughter's hair. "Go grab the drain adapter from the garage, would you?" As Emma skipped off, Mike pulled out his phone to double-check the weather forecast. Yep, freezing temperatures predicted in 5 days. He was cutting it close this year, having stretched pool season as long as possible for Emma and her younger brother, Tyler, who had practically lived in the water all summer. The draining process began without incident. Mike had positioned the drain hose to direct water toward the small creek that ran along the back of his property, the same way he'd done it for the past 3 summers. The gentle slope of his yard meant the water would flow naturally away from both his and his neighbor's foundations, following the landscape's natural drainage pattern. 2 hours into the process, with the pool about half drained, Mike was inspecting the pool liner for any tears when he felt the distinct sensation of being watched. He glanced up to find Patricia standing at the edge of her property, arms crossed tightly over her chest, her face contorted into what his wife Sarah jokingly called the constipated owl look. "Excuse me," Patricia called out, her voice carrying that particular tone that suggested whatever was about to follow wouldn't be pleasant. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" Mike straightened up, plastering on his most neighborly smile. "Just taking down the pool for the season, Patricia. Frost coming next week." Patricia marched closer to the property line, her designer gardening boots somehow remaining spotless despite the recent rain. "You're draining thousands of gallons of chemically treated water directly into the watershed. This is an environmental hazard and a violation of at least 3 HOA regulations." Mike blinked, momentarily stunned. In the 3 previous years of owning this pool, this had never been an issue. The chlorine levels were minimal after a season of use, and he'd always followed the recommendations for proper pool drainage. "Actually, Patricia, the chlorine has dissipated to safe levels. I check it before draining every year and—" "I've already documented everything." Patricia cut him off, holding up her smartphone as if it were evidence in a murder trial. "The HOA will be hearing about this, and so will the Environmental Protection Agency if necessary." As she stormed back to her house, Mike stood in disbelief beside his half-drained pool, the cool autumn breeze suddenly feeling much colder. Little did he know that Patricia's outburst was just the opening act in what would become the most bizarrely memorable pool dismantling in the history of Pinewood Estates. By the next morning, Mike had almost forgotten about the confrontation with Patricia. He whistled as he made breakfast for the kids, planning to finish dismantling the pool after work. Sarah, his wife of 12 years, sat at the kitchen island scrolling through emails on her tablet. "Oh no," she groaned, her eyes widening. "Mike, you need to see this." She turned the tablet toward him, revealing an email from the Pinewood Estates HOA with the subject line, "Your GNT violation report, 47 Maple Drive." Their address. "You've got to be kidding me," Mike muttered, wiping his hands on a dishcloth before taking the tablet. The email contained a formal notice of complaint regarding improper disposal of pool chemicals and water causing potential environmental hazards and property damage to surrounding homes. Attached were several photos of Mike's draining pool, each marked with red circles and arrows as if they were crime scene evidence. "She actually reported us?" Mike's disbelief quickly morphed into irritation. Sarah sighed. "That's not all. Scroll down." Below the formal complaint was a string of messages from other HOA board members accidentally included in the email. Patricia had apparently spent her evening bombarding them with messages, claiming the Sullivans were willfully destroying the local ecosystem and putting children and pets at risk with toxic runoff. "This is ridiculous," Mike said, handing the tablet back to Sarah. "The chlorine levels are practically non-existent after a full season, and the water's going exactly where rainwater naturally flows." "I know that, and you know that," Sarah replied, "but Patricia's got 3 of the board members convinced we're running our own little Chernobyl back there." As if on cue, the doorbell rang. Emma and Tyler, who had been quietly eating their breakfast, perked up. "I'll get it," Emma announced, sliding off her stool. "No, honey, I've got it," Mike said, exchanging a knowing glance with Sarah. Something told him this wasn't a social call. Opening the front door, Mike found himself face to face with Gerald Hoffman, the president of the Pinewood Estates OA. Gerald was a retired accountant who took his HOA duties with the gravity of someone managing national security. "Morning, Mike," Gerald said, his expression somber beneath his carefully calmed comb-over. "Hate to bother you so early, but we've received some concerning reports." Behind Gerald stood Walter Chen from 2 doors down, the HOA treasurer, looking distinctly uncomfortable, and behind him, looking anything but uncomfortable, was Patricia herself, phone already in hand as if prepared to document whatever might transpire. "Gerald, Walter," Mike nodded, deliberately ignoring Patricia. "What can I help you with?" "We understand you're draining your pool in a manner that may violate Section 7, Paragraph 12 of our community guidelines," Gerald said, pulling out a laminated copy of the HOA bylaws from a leather portfolio. Before Mike could respond, Patricia pushed forward. "I have photographic evidence of standing water already accumulating near my property line." Her voice carried down the street, causing a dog to start barking and a neighbor across the way to peek through their blinds. "Actually," Mike said calmly, stepping aside, "would you all like to come see for yourselves? I'd be happy to show you exactly how the drainage is working." Gerald and Walter nodded, while Patricia looked momentarily thrown off by Mike's cooperative attitude. The group followed him through the house and into the backyard, where the pool now sat about 3/4 empty. "As you can see," Mike explained, pointing to the drain hose and the natural slope of the land, the water is following the property's natural gradient toward the creek bed, which is precisely where rainwater from all our properties ultimately flows. There's no standing water anywhere near Patricia's property line. Walter knelt down to examine the soil around the drainage area, then stood up with a nod. "Seems to be draining properly to me, Gerald." "But the chemicals," Patricia protested, her voice rising. "He's dumping chlorinated water directly into the watershed." Mike had anticipated this. From his pocket, he produced a pool testing kit and several dated photographs. "I've been testing the water throughout the season. By this point in the year, the chlorine levels are well below what's considered safe for wildlife. In fact," he added, "they're lower than what's in our tap water." Gerald examined the test results, his expression shifting from concern to mild embarrassment. "Well, that certainly seems to be in order. But what about the noise?" Patricia suddenly changed tactics. "That pump has been running constantly." Mike raised an eyebrow. "The pump ran for about 3 hours yesterday, well within the noise ordinance hours. It's not even running now. This is just gravity doing its work." Just then, a commotion from the front of the house caught everyone's attention. Sarah appeared at the back door, her expression a mix of disbelief and amusement. "Mike," she called, "you might want to come see this." As the group rounded the house back to the front yard, Mike stopped short at the sight before him. A police cruiser now sat in his driveway, lights silently flashing. Patricia's face transformed into a smug smile as she pushed past Mike toward the officer now exiting the vehicle. "Officer," she called out, "I'm so glad you're here. This is exactly the situation I reported." Mike exchanged a bewildered glance with Sarah. The day had just taken yet another bizarre turn, and it wasn't even 9 a.m. The officer who stepped out of the cruiser was tall with broad shoulders and a no-nonsense expression. His nameplate read, "Officer Ramirez." What caught Mike's attention, however, was the barely concealed look of exasperation on the officer's face as Patricia rushed toward him. "Officer, I'm Patricia Winters," she announced as if her name should carry significant weight. "I called about the environmental hazard and potential water damage occurring at this property." Officer Ramirez nodded professionally. "Yes, ma'am. Dispatch informed me of your concerns." He turned to Mike. "You must be the homeowner?" "Mike Sullivan," he confirmed, extending his hand. "And honestly, I'm not entirely sure why the police have been called over me taking down my pool for the season." Patricia interjected before Officer Ramirez could respond. "He's draining thousands of gallons of chemically treated water across multiple properties. It's a violation of EPA regulations and potentially damaging to the local ecosystem." Officer Ramirez removed his sunglasses slowly, his expression neutral but his eyes betraying a hint of wariness that suggested this wasn't his first encounter with an overzealous neighborhood vigilant. "Ma'am, typically environmental concerns are handled by the city's environmental services or the HOA, not the police department." He gestured toward Gerald and Walter, "which I see are already present." "But this is an emergency situation," Patricia insisted, her voice rising an octave. "By the time the environmental department responds, the damage will be done." At this point, several more neighbors had emerged from their homes, drawn by the commotion and the police presence. Mike spotted the Johnsons from across the street watching from their porch, and old Mrs. Feldman walking her Pomeranian slowly past the house for the third time in 5 minutes. "Perhaps we could all take a look at the situation," Officer Ramirez suggested diplomatically. Patricia led the way around the house as if conducting a SWAT team to a hostage situation, with Officer Ramirez, Mike, the HOA representatives, and now several curious neighbors following behind. By the time they reached the backyard, it resembled a small town meeting more than a neighborly dispute. Officer Ramirez surveyed the nearly empty pool, the drain hose, and the gently sloping yard. "So the issue is the pool drainage?" "Exactly." Patricia pointed dramatically at the hose. "Unregulated dumping of pool chemicals." Mike, maintaining his composure, explained the situation once again. "Officer, I've been draining my pool this way for 3 years without issue. The water is following the natural drainage of the property toward the creek bed, which is designed for water flow. The chlorine levels are tested and minimal." Officer Ramirez nodded thoughtfully before turning to the HOA president. "Sir, does the Homeowners Association have specific regulations about pool drainage?" Gerald shuffled uncomfortably. "Well, yes and no. Section 7, paragraph 12 states that homeowners must dispose of pool water in accordance with local regulations and in a manner that does not damage adjacent properties." "And is there any evidence of damage to adjacent properties?" Officer Ramirez asked. Walter, who had been quietly examining the yard, spoke up. "Not that I can see. The drainage pattern seems natural and effective." Patricia's face flushed red. "But my property is at risk. The ground in our shared property line is becoming saturated." "Would you mind if I take a look at your property line, ma'am?" Officer Ramirez asked. "Of course not," Patricia responded, clearly pleased that someone was finally taking her seriously. The entire group trooped over to Patricia's immaculately landscaped yard. Officer Ramirez examined the ground at the property line, kneeling down to touch the soil. "Ma'am, this soil is barely damp. In fact," he added, looking up at the sky, "it appears to be less damp than one would expect given the rain we had 2 days ago." But it will get worse," Patricia sputtered. "And what about the chemicals?" "My koi pond is just 15 feet from the property line." Officer Ramirez stood up, brushing off his knees. "I understand your concern for your fish, ma'am. However, Mr. Sullivan has provided test results showing the chlorine levels are minimal." "Those could be falsified," Patricia declared, prompting gasps from a couple of the onlooking neighbors. Mike felt his patience finally beginning to fray. "Are you accusing me of fabricating water test results, Patricia?" Before she could respond, Officer Ramirez intervened. "Actually, if there's real concern, I could take a sample of the pool water and have it tested by the department." "Please do," Patricia said triumphantly. Officer Ramirez nodded and pulled out a small evidence collection kit from his belt. The crowd watched in silence as he collected a sample of water from the nearly empty pool. After sealing the vial, he pulled out a different device from his pocket. "Since I'm here, I might as well do a quick field test," he said, unscrewing a compartment on the device and adding a few drops of pool water. Patricia watched eagerly, clearly anticipating vindication. After a moment, Officer Ramirez checked the results and looked up. "The chlorine content is approximately 0.2 parts per million, he announced. For context, the EPA allows up to 4 parts per million in drinking water. A murmur went through the gathering of neighbors. Mrs. Feldman, who had joined the backyard congregation with her Pomeranian, spoke up unexpectedly. "That's less than what comes out of our taps," she observed. "I test my water for my orchids." Patricia wasn't ready to concede. "But what about the volume? It's the sheer amount of water causing erosion and potential foundation damage." At this, Walter from the HOA committee cleared his throat. "Actually, the volume of water from this pool is less than what falls during a moderate rainstorm, and it's being released much more slowly." Officer Ramirez turned to Patricia, his professional demeanor starting to crack slightly. "Ma'am, based on what I'm seeing here, there's no violation of any kind occurring. Mr. Sullivan is dismantling his pool, and by mid-afternoon, Mike had finished draining the pool and was now disassembling the frame. Tyler was helping by organizing the various screws and connectors into plastic containers, while Emma sat on the patio working on homework but clearly more interested in the pool deconstruction process. Sarah emerged from the house with a tray of lemonade. "Thought you deserved a break after all the morning excitement," she said, setting a tray on the patio table. Mike wiped his brow and gratefully accepted a glass. "Thanks. I think I've earned it after." Dad. Emma suddenly called out, pointing toward Patricia's house. "Look." Mike turned to see a white van with County Environmental Services emblazoned on the side pulling up in front of Patricia's home. A middle-aged man in khakis and a polo shirt climbed out, clipboard in hand, and was immediately intercepted by Patricia, who had seemingly materialized from nowhere. "You've got to be kidding me," Mike muttered. "She actually called the county?" Sarah asked, though it was barely a question at this point. Mike took a long drink of lemonade. Apparently so. They watched as Patricia animatedly explained something to the environmental inspector, gesturing emphatically toward the Sullivans' yard. The inspector nodded professionally, jotting notes on his clipboard. "Should we go over there?" Sarah asked. Mike shook his head. "Nope. He'll come to us if he needs to." Sure enough, after several minutes of Patricia's presentation, the inspector nodded politely and made his way toward the Sullivans' property. Patricia followed closely behind, her posture suggesting she was expecting imminent vindication. "Good afternoon," the inspector called as he approached the fence. "I'm David Mercer from County Environmental Services. Mind if I come take a look at your pool drainage situation?" "Not at all," Mike replied, setting down his lemonade and walking over to open the gate. "I'm Mike Sullivan." David entered the yard, and Mike couldn't help but notice Patricia hovering just outside the gate, clearly unwilling to enter the contaminated zone, but equally unwilling to miss a moment of what she surely expected to be Mike's comeuppance. "So I understand there's some concern about pool drainage?" David asked, surveying the now empty pool frame in the surrounding yard. "Apparently so," Mike replied, though Officer Ramirez from the police department already checked things out this morning and didn't find any issues. David raised an eyebrow. "The police were called?" "Oh yes," Sarah chimed in, joining them. "It was quite the spectacle." "I see," David said, his expression suggesting he might be dealing with a situation beyond standard environmental concerns. "Well, I'll just take a look around if you don't mind." "Be my guest," Mike said. David spent the next 15 minutes methodically examining the drainage path, taking soil samples at various points and making notes. Mike showed him the water test results and explained the regular maintenance schedule he kept for the pool. Throughout the inspection, Patricia remained at the gate, her eyes following David's every move. Finally, David straightened up and tucked his clipboard under his arm. "Well, Mr. Sullivan, I've completed my assessment." "And?" Patricia called from the gate, unable to contain herself. David turned, seemingly noticing her presence for the first time. "Ma'am, I'll need to discuss my findings with the property owner first, but I'm the one who reported the violation," Patricia protested. "Yes, and I appreciate citizen vigilance," David replied diplomatically. "However, protocol requires I speak with the property owner about any findings before discussing them with reporting parties." Patricia's face flushed with indignation, but David had already turned back to Mike. "Mr. Sullivan, my assessment shows no environmental violations whatsoever. Your drainage method follows natural contours, the water contains chlorine levels well below any threshold of concern, and there's no evidence of soil erosion or property damage." He pulled a card from his pocket. "Here's my contact information if you need it for your records, but as far as County Environmental Services is concerned, this case is closed." "Thank you," Mike said, accepting the card. "I appreciate your thoroughness." David nodded and then turned to Patricia. "Ms. Winters, I'm afraid your complaint doesn't meet the threshold for environmental concern. The pool drainage is being conducted in a manner consistent with county guidelines." Patricia's mouth fell open. "But that's impossible. I specifically read in the county code that Section 14.32 regarding disposal of recreational water." David interrupted, his tone suggesting he'd heard this before. "That section specifically addresses commercial pools with over 20,000 gallons and chemical levels exceeding regulatory thresholds. Mr. Sullivan's residential pool falls under Section 14.57, which permits drainage following natural contours provided chlorine levels are below 0.5 parts per million, which is R." Patricia stared, momentarily speechless, a state that Mike was beginning to realize was uncommon for her. "Now, if there's nothing else," David continued, "I have 3 other calls to make this afternoon." As David headed back to his van, Patricia remained frozen at the gate, her carefully constructed case crumbling before her eyes. Mike almost felt sorry for her, almost, until she suddenly straightened her shoulders and fixed him with a razor-sharp glare. "This isn't over, Sullivan," she hissed. "Not by a long shot." With that ominous declaration, she turned and marched back to her house, her back ramrod straight, dignity barely intact. Sarah moved beside Mike and slipped her arm around his waist. "Well, that was dramatic." "Yeah," Mike agreed. "And somehow I don't think we've seen the last of Hurricane Patricia." "What do you think she'll try next?" Sarah asked. Mike shrugged. "I honestly can't imagine. She's already called the HOA and the police and the county. Who's left? The governor? The United Nations?" They laughed, but there was an underlying uneasiness to it. Something in Patricia's parting words suggested she wasn't someone who gave up easily, especially when her pride was at stake. Their concerns were confirmed later that evening when Mike went to retrieve the mail. Nestled among the bills and flyers was an official-looking envelope. He opened it to find a formal letter on legal letterhead. "Notice of NTNT to pursue legal action. Dear Mr. Sullivan, this office has been retained by Ms. Patricia Winters regarding ongoing water trespass, environmental negligence, and nuisance conditions originating from your property at 47 Maple Drive. Mike stared at the letter in disbelief, then looked up at Patricia's house. Through the front window, he could see her watching him, a triumphant smile playing across her lips. Sarah, Mike called as he walked back into the house, the letter clutched in his hand. You're not going to believe this. The neighborhood pool dispute had just escalated to an entirely new level.